Nathaniel Whitaker hadn't cried since the night his mother died, with nothing but a pawned locket and a cold floor beneath her. He'd built an empire since then, land timber wealth enough to last 3 generations. But that summer of 1816, he stood in his own grand parlor and placed 4 envelopes on a table, like a man laying flowers on a grave. He was looking for a soul worth trusting. What he didn't know was that the woman he'd been searching for his whole life was standing just outside the door, not as a guest, as a servant. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 came to Virginia like a slow-burning fire, dry heat, restless air, and a silence over Whitaker Hall that nobody quite dared to break. Nathaniel Whitaker had not announced a courtship. He had announced a test. Word spread through the county the way all dangerous words do, quietly at first, then all at once. The heir to the Whitaker estate, the most powerful and least understood man in 3 counties, had sent formal letters to 4 families. Not love letters, not invitations to supper. Letters with a single sentence inside, handwritten in his clean, deliberate script. Come to Whitaker Hall on the 15th of July. Bring your willingness to be judged. Judge Samuel Reed was the only man Nathaniel had told the full plan to, and even he had leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long, slow moment before he said anything. Nathaniel, Reed finally said, you do understand that 4 of the finest families in Virginia are going to be deeply personally offended by what you're about to do. Good, Nathaniel said. He didn't look up from the papers on his desk. Offended people tell the truth faster than comfortable ones. Reed shook his head. You're not choosing a business partner. You're choosing a wife. I've buried 1 business partner already. Nathaniel set down his pen and looked at his old friend with the kind of steadiness that wasn't calm. It was controlled. My father chose a wife the way men of his generation chose everything, by what she looked like standing in a parlor. My mother spent 20 years in a house where she was decorative and disposable. I will not repeat that mistake. Reed studied him. And the money, $5,000 to each woman. That's right. That's $20,000, Nathaniel. I know what $20,000 is, Samuel. And you're giving it away as a what a test. Nathaniel finally stood, moved toward the window, and looked out at the long, heat-shimmered road that led away from his property. I'm not giving it away. I'm investing it. Every person shows you who they are the moment you put real resources in their hands. Power, money, freedom. Those things don't change a person. They reveal one. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, and if none of them pass? Nathaniel turned back. His expression didn't shift. Then none of them pass. The 4 women arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitcomb came first in a dress the color of cream silk that cost more than most men earned in a season. She was 26, the daughter of a family that had held the same land in Virginia for 3 generations, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been told she was anything less than exceptional. She was beautiful in a careful, deliberate way, the kind of beauty that required effort and expected applause for it. She walked into Nathaniel's parlor, extended her hand, and said, Mr. Whitaker, I hope you haven't kept us waiting long. You're the first to arrive, he said. He did not take her hand. He gestured toward a chair. Clara sat down with all the practiced grace of a woman who had been performing for rooms her whole life. She looked around the parlor with the mild assessing gaze of someone calculating what she would change about it. Rebecca Harrow arrived second. She was from Boston, the daughter of a shipping merchant, and she brought with her a leather satchel of documents she'd apparently been reviewing in the carriage. She was direct, intelligent, and looked at Nathaniel the way she probably looked at trade contracts, searching for the clause that could be turned to her advantage. I appreciate a man who doesn't waste time with pleasantries, she said, sitting down across from Clara. I've read everything written about your business interests. I have thoughts. I'm sure you do, Nathaniel said. He offered nothing more. Eleanor Vance was third, a widow from Charleston, 31, with the polished warmth of a woman who had learned that charm was its own form of currency. She shook his hand, called him "Darling Nathaniel," as though they were already old friends, and spent the first 2 minutes of conversation mentioning 3 senators and a governor by their first names. Margaret Bellamy came last with her servant, trailing 3 steps behind her. Margaret was the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet. Dark-haired, fine-boned, with the slow smile of a woman who had never needed to ask for anything twice. She walked in as though she already owned the hall, kissed the air beside Clara's cheek, gave Rebecca a polite nod, and settled into the best chair in the room with the ease of someone returning to a throne. The servant girl stopped just inside the doorway. She was young, no more than 22, with plain brown hair pulled back under a cap and a dress that had been mended at the hem at least twice. She didn't look at the room the way the other women had. She didn't assess it. She just stood quietly with her hands folded, watching everything and saying nothing, with the particular stillness of a person who had learned that being noticed too quickly was never a good thing. Her name was Grace Miller. Nobody introduced her. Nobody looked at her twice. Nathaniel glanced at her once, just once briefly, and then looked away. He kept them waiting for exactly 10 minutes. It was not an accident. When he walked back in, Judge Reed at his side, he carried a flat wooden box under one arm and set it on the table without ceremony. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table and looked at each woman in turn, and the room felt the shift in temperature that always happened when a man with real authority decided to stop performing patience. "I'll be brief," he said. "I have no interest in courtship rituals. I have no interest in being charmed. I've been charmed before, and I've found it to be mostly a waste of everyone's time." Clara's chin came up slightly. Rebecca's expression went carefully neutral. Eleanor's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Margaret glanced at her own reflection in the dark glass of a framed painting on the wall, touched the curl at her temple, and gave Nathaniel a smile that had never failed her before. He didn't return it. "Inside this box," he continued, "are 4 sealed envelopes. Each one contains a bank draft for $5,000. That is money drawn on my personal accounts. It is real, it is yours to spend, and you will have 30 days to spend it however you see fit." He paused. "However you see fit. I will not give you instructions. I will not give you suggestions. What you choose to do with that money, and what you choose to bring back to show me, will tell me everything I need to know about who you are." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either a storm or an explosion. It was Clara who broke it first. "You're testing us," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but her eyes were not. "As though we were students." "I'm giving you an opportunity," Nathaniel said. "Whether you experience it as a test says something about you already." Clara's jaw tightened. Rebecca leaned forward. $5,000. What's the return expectation? What constitutes a passing result? "There is no instruction manual, Miss Harrow. That's the point." "There's always criteria," Rebecca said flatly. "Even when the criteria isn't stated, it exists. You're looking for something specific. What is it?" Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "Something real." Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, Nathaniel, you are dramatic." She reached for an envelope with the easy confidence of a woman collecting what she'd already decided was hers. "I rather enjoy a challenge." Margaret picked up her envelope last. She turned it over once in her fingers, looked at it with mild curiosity, and then held it out behind her without turning around. "Grace," she said, "take this." The room went very still. Grace Miller stepped forward from the doorway and took the envelope from Margaret's outstretched hand. Margaret smiled at Nathaniel. "I trust my people completely. That's a quality in a mistress of a household, isn't it?" Nathaniel said nothing. He looked at the servant girl holding the envelope. Her face was unreadable, her eyes down, and then he looked back at Margaret. He said, "The 30 days begin today." After the women left, Judge Reed poured himself a glass of bourbon and stood by the fireplace, even though it was summer and no fire was burning. "You know what they're going to spend it on," he said. "I have a good idea." Nathaniel agreed. "Clara will buy something beautiful. Rebecca will buy something profitable. Eleanor will buy something powerful." Reed swirled his glass. "And Margaret will spend hers on something to impress you without ever having to think very hard about it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He had moved to the corner cabinet, the one he never opened in company, and drawn out a small, cracked pocket watch. He held it in both hands, not looking at Reed, just holding it the way a man holds the last evidence that something real once existed. "My mother's name was Catherine," he said quietly. "She was the daughter of a school teacher in Richmond. She married my father when she was 19 because he had land, and she had nothing. She thought that was a trade worth making." He turned the watch over once. "She spent 30 years discovering what that trade actually cost." Nathaniel. "She owned one piece of jewelry her whole life, a silver mourning brooch. Small thing. Portrait inside it, miniature of herself as a young woman before the years got to her. My father pawned it in the winter of 1802 when the tobacco crop failed." He set the watch down. "He never bought it back. She died 4 years later without it." Reed was very quiet. "I found the pawn record 2 years ago," Nathaniel said. "The brooch went to a debt collector named Silas Crow. After that, nothing. It could be anywhere. It could be gone." He exhaled slowly. "But I think about it. I think about it more than I should." Reed set down his glass. "You didn't tell any of the women about it?" "No." "Then none of them can use it." "That's correct." "Then what are you hoping for, Nathaniel, truly?" Nathaniel looked at him. "I don't know yet, but whatever it is, I'll recognize it when I see it." Wink. Grace Miller did not sleep that night. She sat on the narrow bed in the small room she shared with no one, which was the one good thing about being Margaret Bellamy's personal servant. Margaret had given her a room of her own, so there'd be no gossip about what she knew. She knew plenty. She knew, for instance, that Margaret had not read a single line of the letter Nathaniel had sent. She'd handed it to Grace to read aloud and then spent the rest of the carriage ride discussing the cut of her new traveling gown. She knew that Margaret's plan for the $5,000 was in its entirety to tell Grace to spend it on something meaningful and moving, and then present whatever Grace bought as her own decision, her own heart on display. "Make me look thoughtful," Margaret had said on the road back from Whitaker Hall. She said it like she was ordering a dish at supper. "He's clearly one of those men who wants a woman with feelings. Buy me some feelings, Grace." Grace had stared out the carriage window at the hot Virginia afternoon. "You want me to buy you feelings? Don't repeat things back to me like I've said something strange. You know what I mean. Buy something meaningful, something a man like that would find moving." A pause. "But something tasteful, not poor." Grace had nodded once and said nothing more. Now she sat with the envelope on the bed beside her unopened and turned over what she knew not just about Margaret but about Nathaniel Whitaker. She had seen him twice before this. Once at a dinner party at the Randolph estate, where she'd been serving as part of the borrowed staff for the evening. He'd slipped away from the supper table and gone to the library, not knowing anyone was in there, and Grace had been in there quietly restacking books on the lower shelves, invisible in the way servants are always invisible. He'd stood in front of the window with his hand pressed flat against the glass and breathed like a man who had just come back from somewhere very far away. After a moment, he'd drawn the cracked pocket watch from his coat and held it. He didn't look like a rich man in that moment. He looked like a son. Grace had not moved, had not made a sound, and he'd left a few minutes later without knowing she was there. The second time was 3 weeks ago, when she'd overheard two of the estate's stable hands talking near the kitchen garden. One of them had worked years before for a man named Silas Crow, a debt collector out of Richmond, a man with a reputation that made people lower their voices. The stable hand said Crow had a warehouse full of pawned property, said he never sold anything, just held it all behind locked doors like a crow hoarding bright objects, said he'd once heard Crow brag about holding a silver mourning brooch that had belonged to the wife of some ruined planter. Grace had heard that and filed it away in the quiet, careful part of her mind where she kept everything that mattered. She looked at the envelope now. $5,000. She had earned $4 in a good month. She had never in her 22 years held more than 20 at one time. She knew what $5,000 was in terms of her own life. It was a cottage, a vegetable garden, enough food to last a winter without fear. It was the kind of safety she had stopped letting herself imagine, because imagination, without possibility, was just a different kind of pain. She opened the envelope. She looked at the bank draft for a long moment. She folded it very carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and made a decision that she did not yet know would change everything. She went to Richmond the next morning. Margaret had not asked where she was going. Margaret had said, "Take the wagon, take whatever you need, and don't embarrass me." That was the whole of her instruction. Grace went to 3 places before noon. The first was the records office, where she paid a clerk 50 cents to pull the property transfer documents on a man named Silas Crow. The clerk was slow, and the room was hot, and Grace stood with her hands folded and waited with the patience of someone who had spent her whole life waiting for things that were never for her. She found the warehouse address. She found something else, too. Crow's business ledgers had been partially submitted as evidence in a debt dispute 2 years prior. The court records were public. She read through them carefully, slowly translating the columns of cramped numbers in her head. Crow had not only held pawned property, he had bought debt. Personal debt. Family debt, the kind of debt that followed people into poorhouses. He owned the outstanding obligations of dozens of families, and he owned outright the deed to a debtor's institution on the edge of the city, a place called the Marsh Street House. Grace knew the Marsh Street House. Every poor woman in Richmond knew it. It was where you ended up when there was nowhere else to go, and it was the kind of nowhere that left marks. She stood outside the records office in the midday heat of a Virginia summer and thought about a dead woman named Catherine Whitaker, who had spent her last years in a house where nobody saw her. She thought about what it might mean to a man like Nathaniel Whitaker if someone finally saw her. Then she tucked the documents under her arm and went to find Silas Crow. He was not what she expected, which was its own kind of useful. She had expected loud cruelty, the kind that announces itself. Instead, Crow was thin-pale and spoke in the murmuring tone of a man who had long since learned that the quieter you were, the more afraid people became. He looked at Grace across the cluttered desk of his warehouse office and said, "You want to buy something?" "Yes, sir." "What?" "A silver mourning brooch, small, portrait miniature inside. It came to you from a pawnhouse in 1802 from a man named Whitaker." Something moved behind Crow's pale eyes. "That's a specific item." "Yes, sir." "What makes you think I have it?" "Because your ledger from 1804 lists it." "Court record, sir. It went into evidence in the Hargrove dispute." She held his gaze. I read carefully. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Grace did not look away. "I might have it," he said finally. "Might be willing to part with it, for the right consideration. I'd also like to purchase the deed to the Marsh Street house." The temperature in the room changed. Crow sat back slowly. "That's not a brooch." "No, sir, it's not. The Marsh Street house is a functioning institution. It's a building full of women who have nowhere else to be," Grace said. Her voice was quiet, level. The way her voice always was, the way you learned to keep it when you'd grown up in places where raising it got you nothing but trouble. "And I have the resources to make a fair offer on both." "You?" He looked at her, the mended hem, the plain cap, the steady brown eyes. "You have resources." "I do today," Grace said. Crow studied her for another long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who thought he was about to win something. "Let's talk about what fair looks like." They talked for 2 hours. Grace walked out of Silas Crow's warehouse with a silver mourning brooch wrapped in a square of muslin, a signed deed transfer for the Marsh Street house, and $1,400 remaining in the bank draft. Her hands were shaking when she got back to the wagon. She sat there for a moment in the summer heat with her heart going hard and fast in her chest. She had just done something reckless. She had just done something that was not hers to do. She was spending another woman's money, acting on another woman's behalf, making decisions that had nothing to do with Margaret Bellamy's beauty or Margaret Bellamy's future. She had just spent $5,000 not to impress a man, but to heal one. And she did not yet know whether that was the bravest thing she had ever done or the most foolish. She unwrapped the muslin with careful fingers and looked at the brooch. It was small, silver tarnished at the edges. The clasp was worn. The portrait inside, painted in miniature on ivory barely the size of her thumbnail, showed a young woman with dark eyes and a quiet expression. Grace looked at it for a long time. She thought. She looked like a woman who had learned to keep her voice level. She folded the muslin back, tucked the brooch into the inside pocket of her apron close to her ribs, close to her heartbeat, and picked up the reins. She had 28 days left, and a great deal left to do. Grace did not tell Margaret what she had done. Not that morning, not that evening, not in the 3 days that followed. Margaret did not ask. Margaret was busy with her dressmaker, busy with letters to Charleston, busy being the kind of woman whose attention moved from surface to surface, like sunlight on water, bright, warm, and gone, before you could hold it. Grace moved through those 3 days quietly. She always moved quietly. It was a skill she had developed the way poor people develop most of their skills, not from wanting to, but from understanding that the cost of being noticed at the wrong moment was never worth it. But she was not idle. She went back to Richmond twice more that week. The first time she met with a lawyer, a small, cautious man named Mr. Aldous Finch, who had an office above a dry goods store, and who looked at Grace with the particular expression of a man trying to decide whether she was real or whether he was being tested. She set the deed to the Marsh Street house on his desk, along with a written proposal she had drafted herself by candlelight in the 3 hours after Margaret had gone to sleep. "I want this building transferred into a charitable trust," she told him. "I want the trust documents to name it a free house of mercy for indigent women and children. No debt requirements for entry. No labor obligations. Clean beds and medical attendance." Finch looked at the deed. He looked at Grace. He looked at the deed again. "Miss, I'm sorry you said Miller." "That's right. Miss Miller." He folded his hands on the desk. "Are you aware of what the Marsh Street house currently is?" "Yes." "It's a debtor's institution. There are women in that building right now who are there because they couldn't pay what they owed." "I know that." "And you intend to what simply let them go." "I intend to make it a place worth going to," Grace said. "Not a place you end up when there's nothing left." She looked at him steadily. "Can you draw up the trust documents, or not, Mr. Finch?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "It'll take a week. You have 10 days, Grace said. "I'll be back." She walked out into the summer heat feeling something she didn't entirely have a name for. Something between terror and certainty. The feeling of having stepped off a ledge and not yet knowing whether the ground was close or far. The second trip to Richmond was harder. She went to the Marsh Street house itself. She stood outside it for a moment. She let herself do that just a moment, and then she went in. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Doris Pelham, and she was not cruel in an obvious way. She was the worst kind practical. She ran the Marsh Street house the way a farmer runs a field efficiently, without sentiment, with an eye on the yield and not the soil. Mrs. Pelham looked at Grace and said, "You're not one of ours." "No, ma'am." "Then what do you want?" "I want to look around," Grace said, "and I want to talk to whoever's in charge of the accounts." "I am in charge of the accounts," Mrs. Pelham said flatly. "Then we should talk." What Grace saw in that building, what she heard, what she understood, in the particular way that people who have been close to desperation always understand, hardened something in her chest into something that no longer moved. There were 11 women inside. 3 of them were sick. 2 had children who slept on floor pallets beside them. 1 was old enough to be Grace's grandmother, and she sat in the corner with her hands in her lap, doing absolutely nothing, with the particular vacancy of someone who had used up all her hope and was simply waiting. Grace sat with that old woman for 20 minutes. She didn't say much. She asked her name. It was Harriet, and she asked how long she'd been there. Harriet said she couldn't remember anymore, which was the kind of answer that meant too long. When Grace left, she went directly to the nearest church and sat in a pew and pressed her hands together hard and breathed. She was spending someone else's money. She was making decisions that were not hers to make. She was building something in someone else's name that might come crashing down the moment Margaret opened her mouth in front of Nathaniel Whitaker. And she knew it. She knew all of it. She sat in that church pew and laid it all out plainly in her own mind, the way her father had taught her, to lay out tools before a job, everything visible, nothing hidden from yourself. Then she stood up, walked out, and kept going. Because the alternative was going back to Margaret's house and spending the next 30 days watching a beautiful woman practice expressions in a mirror. And Grace Miller had long since decided that there were worse things than recklessness. Helplessness was one of them. Meanwhile, the other women were spending. Clara Whitcomb made her decision within 48 hours of leaving Whitaker Hall, which should have been the first sign that she had not thought about it very hard. She commissioned a French carriage from a craftsman in Alexandria, lacquered black with brass fittings upholstered in ivory silk, and ordered 3 gowns from a dressmaker who had studied in Paris. She told her mother it was an investment in presentation. "A man like Nathaniel Whitaker," Clara said, smoothing her glove over her wrist, "needs a wife who can represent his name in any room in Virginia. I intend to be that woman." Her mother looked at her for a moment. "He didn't ask for a carriage, Clara." "He didn't ask for anything. That's the point. I'm choosing what matters." Clara picked up her fan. "Presentation is character. If he doesn't understand that, then he doesn't understand people." Her mother said nothing more. She had learned over the years that Clara's certainties were walls solid white and very difficult to get through. Rebecca Harrow did not commission a carriage. Rebecca Harrow spent the first week doing research. She wrote 6 letters, received 4 responses, and by the end of the second week had identified a shipping partnership out of Baltimore that had room for a new investor. The venture dealt in dry goods and cotton, a sound bet, she told herself. Profitable, demonstrably smart. The kind of investment that would show Nathaniel Whitaker that she was not a woman to be managed. She was a woman to be partnered with. She signed her name to the contract on a Wednesday afternoon and felt the satisfaction of a woman who had solved a problem correctly. She did not ask in her research where the cotton came from. She did not ask what the labor arrangement was on the plantation supplying it. She told herself that was not her concern, that business was business, that sentiment was a luxury that serious people could not afford. She was wrong about all of it. But she did not know that yet. Eleanor Vance wrote 12 dinner invitations within the first week. She hosted a supper in Charleston that cost her $1,100, food, wine, musicians, the loan of a ballroom from a friend who owed her a favor. She invited 3 state senators, 2 federal judges, a newspaper publisher, and the wives of all of them. She was charming. She was brilliant. She had the gift of making every person in a room feel as though they were the only one in it. By the end of the evening, she had extracted 3 promises, 2 introductions, and the sense that her social position in Charleston had risen half a tier. She leaned back in her carriage on the way home and smiled to herself. She was building Nathaniel a network. She was building him influence. Surely that was what a man with a great estate needed most, a wife who could open doors. She did not consider not once that the doors she was opening led only to rooms where people like herself were already gathered doing what they had always done for the benefit of no one new. Margaret heard about Clara's carriage from her own mother's letter, and about Eleanor's supper from a mutual acquaintance in Charleston, and about Rebecca's investment from the kind of social gossip that traveled the county circuit like weather. She heard all of this, and felt nothing in particular because Margaret's primary relationship with competition was to assume she had already won it. "What are the others doing?" she asked Grace one evening, not looking up from her needlework. "Spending money on things that make them look capable," Grace said. She was folding linens. She kept her voice flat. "Well, what am I doing?" "I'm not certain yet," Grace said. "I'll let you know." Margaret looked up at that. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You'll let me know?" Grace met her gaze. "You told me to make you look thoughtful." "I'm being thorough," There was a moment, a brief electric moment, where something moved behind Margaret's eyes. Not suspicion exactly. More like the first faint awareness that she had handed something to someone and was not entirely sure what she'd handed. Then the moment passed and Margaret looked back down at her needlework. "Just don't make me look poor," she said. "Whatever you do." Grace turned back to the linens. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Her heart was hammering. Because 2 days earlier Mr. Aldous Finch had sent her a message. The trust documents were ready, and he had added a single sentence at the bottom in his small, careful handwriting. "Miss Miller, I believe you should know that the records I pulled in preparing this trust indicate that the current deed to the Marsh Street house carries a lien filed by one Silas Crowe in 1811 against the estate of a Catherine Whitaker. I do not know if this is relevant to you, but I thought you should see it." Grace had read that sentence 4 times. Then she had sat down very slowly on the nearest chair and thought about what it meant. Nathaniel's mother had not simply had a brooch pawned. She had had a debt filed against her name, a formal lien, a document with teeth connected to the very building where women went when they had nothing left. It was not a coincidence. Silas Crowe had not simply collected objects. He had collected people. He had made it his business to own the paper trails of ruined families, and Catherine Whitaker's name was in his ledgers twice. Grace went back to Finch the next morning. "I need to know," she said, "whether this lien can be discharged as part of the trust transfer." Finch removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "It's possible, legally complex, and there's a cost." "How much?" he told her. It would take almost everything she had left. Grace sat with that number for a long moment. If she discharged the lien, she would have barely $200 remaining. Not enough for anything decorative. Not enough to buy Margaret a single piece of furniture to impress Nathaniel Whitaker with. Just enough to file the paperwork and let the rest speak for itself. She thought about Harriet sitting in the corner of the Marsh Street house with her hands in her lap and nowhere to go. She thought about a young woman painted on an ivory chip no bigger than a thumbnail, dark-eyed and quiet. She thought about Nathaniel standing at a library window, with his hand flat against the glass, breathing like a man who had come back from somewhere very far. "Discharge the lien," she said. "All of it." Finch wrote it down. "Miss Miller," he said, not looking up. "Whoever you're doing this for, I hope they deserve it." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I'm doing it for the women in that building," she said. "Nathaniel Whitaker is just the mechanism." It was the truest thing she had said in weeks, and also she suspected not entirely true. She didn't examine that too closely. The days moved faster after that. Grace hired a woman named Mrs. Abel, a widow practical and capable, who had run a boarding house for 6 years, before her husband's debts had caught up with both of them, to begin the work of transitioning the Marsh Street house. Mrs. Abel walked through the building twice, asked 3 direct questions, and then rolled up her sleeves. "When does it officially transfer?" she asked. 12 days, Grace said. "And the women inside stay. They stay, and they get a clean room and medical attention, and nobody chases them out the door because they can't pay." Mrs. Abel looked at her for a moment. "Who put you in charge of this?" Grace almost laughed. Almost. "Nobody," she said. "That's why it's getting done." Back at Margaret's house, the tension was building in the particular way it builds when something is being kept in a small space, quietly around the edges, invisible until it isn't. Margaret had started asking questions that were more specific than her usual vague instructions. She asked where Grace had been on her trips to Richmond. She asked what the money had bought. Grace answered honestly in pieces. "I've been handling the arrangements, ma'am. It's nearly settled. I'll show you everything when it's done." And Margaret accepted those answers the way she accepted most things that were handled for her, without looking too closely. But 3 days before the 30 days were up, something shifted. One of Margaret's cousins, a woman named Louisa, who kept her ear to every social current in Richmond, came to call. She sat in Margaret's parlor and drank tea and said very casually, "I heard the most peculiar thing this week." Margaret looked up. "What's that?" "Someone's putting together a trust for the Marsh Street house, a charitable foundation, Bed and medicine for poor women, no debts required. Louisa stirred her tea. The deed transfer came through the county records yesterday. Whoever is behind it paid off every outstanding lien on the building, including one that had sat on the books against the Whitaker family for 15 years. The room went very still. Margaret set down her teacup. She turned very slowly and looked at Grace, who was standing near the door. Grace did not move. She held Margaret's gaze with both hands metaphorically behind her back, the way you hold still when the thing you're afraid of finally arrives. "Grace," Margaret said. Her voice was soft. That particular softness was worse than volume. "What did you spend my money on?" Grace breathed in once. Then she said quietly and plainly, "I bought your character, Miss Bellamy. I just hope it fits." The color drained from Margaret's face. Louisa looked between the two of them with the bright, avid attention of a woman who understood she was witnessing something important. "You spent $5,000, Margaret said slowly, "on a house. For poor women. And a brooch," Grace said, "and a lien discharge and legal fees, and the wages of a woman named Mrs. Abel, who is currently making sure 11 people have clean beds for the first time in months." "A brooch," Margaret repeated. The word came out very flat. "A silver mourning brooch. It belonged to Nathaniel Whitaker's mother." Grace kept her voice level. She was very good at that. "It's been in Silas Crow's warehouse for 14 years. His mother died without it." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then Margaret stood up. She was not a dramatic woman by nature. Drama required acknowledging that things were not going your way, and Margaret had spent most of her life arranging things so that they always were. But she stood up and she pointed at Grace, and her hand was not entirely steady. "You had no right," she said. "That was my money. You were acting for me. You were supposed to make me look thoughtful," Grace said. "Yes, ma'am, that's what you told me. Not like this." The composure cracked. Not a poorhouse. Grace, not dead women's jewelry. I told you tasteful. I told you something that would move him, something that would make him think you have a heart," Grace said quietly. "Those were your exact words." Another silence. Louisa had set down her teacup and was watching with the focused attention of someone who would be retelling this conversation for months. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Get out of my sight," she said. "We'll discuss this later." Grace nodded once. She moved toward the door. "Grace." Margaret's voice stopped her, low, controlled, furious. "If you think for one moment that I'm going to stand up in front of Nathaniel Whitaker and present that brooch and that building as if I chose it." "You can tell him whatever you like," Grace said. "The documents have your name on them. I put your name on everything." She opened the door and walked through it. In the hallway, she pressed her back against the wall and let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking again, the same way they'd shaken outside Crow's warehouse, the same unsteady aftermath of having done something large and irreversible. She had 7 days left before the return to Whitaker Hall. 7 days to decide whether any of this had been worth the cost. 7 days before, she would stand in a room full of women who had 400 times her social standing and wait to see whether truth was actually worth anything at all, or whether, as she had sometimes feared, it was just another thing that poor people said to make the world feel less unfair. She pressed her palms flat against the wall and breathed until her hands steadied. Then she went to find Mrs. Abel and ask about the roof on the Marsh Street house, because whatever happened in 7 days, 11 women needed clean beds tonight. The morning of the return to Whitaker Hall was the kind of morning that felt like it had been holding its breath. Margaret had not spoken to Grace in 3 days. Not since Louisa's visit. Not since the conversation in the hallway that had ended with Grace walking out and Margaret standing in her parlor, trying to reassemble a composure that had come apart faster than she'd expected. In those 3 days, Grace had gone about her work the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. She laid out Margaret's dresses. She pressed the ribbons. She carried the trunk down to the carriage when it was time to go. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself further. She had said everything she needed to say, and she had learned a long time ago that repeating yourself to someone who didn't want to hear it was just a different kind of waste. Margaret, for her part, had made a decision. She had made the decision the same way she made most of her decisions, not by thinking it through, but by deciding what she wanted and working backward from there. What she wanted was to walk into Nathaniel Whitaker's parlor and present that wooden box, as though she had chosen every single thing inside it herself. She would be gracious about it. She would be moving. She had practiced the expression in the mirror, a particular soft sorrow, mixed with quiet dignity, the face of a woman who understood loss and had done something meaningful about it. She could do this. She was very good at performing feelings she didn't have. She told Grace none of this. But when Grace lifted the small wooden box into the carriage, the box where Grace had carefully placed the brooch wrapped in fresh muslin beside the folded trust documents and the legal papers from Finch's office, Margaret watched her with the careful eyes of a woman recalculating. "Sit up front," Margaret said. Grace looked at her. "With the driver," Margaret said. "You're the help, Grace. Act like it." Grace climbed up front without a word. The carriage moved. And for the entire 2-hour ride to Whitaker Hall, she sat with the summer wind in her face and her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating with the particular steadiness of someone who has already done the hard thing and is simply waiting to see what it costs. The other women arrived at nearly the same time, which had the accidental effect of making the whole thing feel more like a courtroom than a parlor call. Clara's new carriage pulled up first, the lacquered one black and brass conspicuous as a shout. Clara stepped out in one of her Paris Maid gowns and looked around with the satisfied expression of a woman who believed the opening statement had already been made. Rebecca arrived second with her leather satchel. Eleanor came third, animated and warm, kissing cheeks, touching arms, performing ease so fluently it almost looked like the real thing. Margaret's carriage came last. Grace climbed down from the driver's box and stood at the rear of the group as they were shown inside. Nobody looked at her. She was used to that, but she noticed as she crossed the threshold that Judge Samuel Reed was already in the parlor. He stood near the fireplace with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was there as a witness, not a guest. He caught Grace's eye for exactly 1 second, and something in his face shifted. Not recognition exactly, more like attention. She looked away before it meant anything. Nathaniel was standing at the head of the table. He had not sat down. He rarely sat in situations where he was about to learn something Grace had noticed. He stood the way people stand when they're bracing for impact, or when they're ready to move fast in whatever direction the truth required. He said, "Thank you for coming back. Let's not waste the morning." Clara went first. She presented the carriage commission papers with the confidence of a woman revealing a winning hand. She described the craftsman, the materials, the design. She talked about what it said about refinement, about representing a great name, about the kind of wife who elevated a household simply by being seen in it. Nathaniel listened. He let her finish. Then he said, "You spent $5,000 on a carriage and 3 dresses." Clara's chin came up. "On presents. On the statement, a great house makes to the world." The world. Nathaniel said, "Doesn't ride in my carriage. My wife would. And I don't need a wife who knows how to look right in a carriage. I need a wife who knows what to do when everything that makes the carriage possible falls apart." He looked at her steadily. "My mother lost everything. She had no carriage and no dress and no French craftsman. What she needed was someone who could see that she was suffering. You bought me a mirror, Miss Whitcomb. I already have one." Clara's face went very still. The careful beauty held, but the certainty behind it cracked, and the crack was visible, and she knew it was visible. And that was the worst part of it. She sat down. Rebecca opened her satchel. She laid the contracts on the table the way a lawyer lays evidence deliberately, with the confidence of someone who has prepared their argument. She explained the venture, the projected return, the market position. She used precise language. She was impressive in the way that very smart people are impressive when they are completely wrong about what matters. Nathaniel picked up one of the contracts and read it. He was quiet for a moment. "This cotton," he said. "Where's it coming from?" Rebecca paused. "A plantation in Georgia." "And the labor, a beat too long. It's a working plantation." A working plantation, Nathaniel repeated. He set the contract down very carefully. My grandfather was a poor man, Miss Harrow. He broke his back on land that belonged to someone else. I have spent 20 years making sure that every person who works on my property is compensated and housed and treated as a human being. And you want to hand me a profit built on the backs of people who have none of those things. He shook his head. You didn't buy me a business. You bought me a reason to be ashamed. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Business requires choices, Nathaniel said. That's all business requires. You made yours. The room was very quiet. Eleanor stepped forward with the easy grace of a woman who had spent 31 years learning how to walk into difficult rooms and own them. She smiled at Nathaniel, the full, warm, genuine-seeming smile that had opened every door in Charleston, and she laid her guest list on the table like an offering. She explained the supper, the senators, the judges, the newspaper publisher, the connections she had built, the doors she had opened, the influence she had positioned at his disposal. She spoke about it with real pleasure, because she genuinely believed in what she'd done. She genuinely thought she was handing him something valuable. I built you a network, she said. A man with your resources and your ambitions needs people in the right places. I know how to put them there. Nathaniel looked at the guest list. He recognized some of the names. Senator Aldridge, he said. I know what he voted for last year. Do you? Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. Judge Portman, Nathaniel continued. He's dismissed 3 cases in the last 2 years that should have gone to trial. Do you know why? Nathaniel, that's politics. That's simply how you bought me influence from people who already have too much of it and who use it badly. His voice wasn't angry. It was something quieter and more final than anger. I don't need more power in the same rooms. I need someone who understands why those rooms are broken. He folded the guest list in half. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I truly am. Eleanor took her list back. She held herself together beautifully. She was nothing if not disciplined, but her hands as she tucked the paper into her purse were not entirely steady. And then it was Margaret's turn. She rose with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and had choreographed it in advance. She reached for the wooden box on the table beside her, the box Grace had placed there when they arrived, the box Margaret had not opened, had not touched, had barely looked at for 7 days. She set it in front of Nathaniel. She arranged her expression into the look she had practiced. Quiet sorrow, warm dignity, the face of a woman who felt things deeply and had done something meaningful about it. She had even prepared the first line. Mr. Whitaker, she said, I spent a great deal of time thinking about what you truly needed, not what would impress you, not what would elevate your social position or multiply your fortune. She paused. I thought about what might heal something. Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, more like sharpened. He reached for the box. He opened it. The muslin square lay on top. He unfolded it with the particular care of a man who had been disappointed enough times to move slowly when something felt important. The legal papers were beneath Finch's trust documents, the deed transfer, the lien discharge, all of it bound with a thin leather cord. But it was the brooch he saw first. The silver was tarnished at the edges. The clasp was worn. It was small enough to sit in the center of his palm, and it did. He lifted it out, and it rested there, and he looked at it, and the room went so quiet that the only sound was the summer wind through the open window at the far end. His mother's face looked up at him, painted on ivory barely the size of a thumbnail, dark eyes, a quiet expression. The expression of a young woman who had not yet learned how much the years were going to cost her. Nathaniel Whitaker did not make a sound. He stood there for a long moment with his mother's face in his hand, and something happening behind his eyes that had nothing to do with any of the women in the room, that had nothing to do with the test, or the money, or the 30 days. He was somewhere else entirely. He was back in a cold house in 1802, and he was 12 years old, and the thing that should have been there was gone. Judge Reed at the fireplace turned his face away. When Nathaniel finally looked up, his expression had changed. Something had come down in it. Some wall that had been up so long people had probably stopped noticing it was a wall. He looked at Margaret. She was ready. She had her story prepared, her expression in place, her voice arranged into the right register of humble grace. She opened her mouth. "Mr. Whitaker, where did you find it?" Well, I researched." "You researched Silas Crow?" His voice was careful, specific. Margaret hesitated. There were people I spoke to." "What's his address?" Nathaniel said. "A beat." I had people handle the—" "What street is his warehouse on?" The silence lasted 2 full seconds. In a room, that quiet 2 seconds was its own kind of verdict. "I don't recall precisely," Margaret said. Her voice had gone thin. Nathaniel looked down at the papers. He untied the leather cord and began to read. He read slowly, the way he read everything methodically, with full attention. The room watched him. Clara watched with her hands in her lap. Rebecca watched with her arms folded. Eleanor watched with the expression of a woman beginning to understand that something much larger than a social competition was happening. Nathaniel read the trust documents. He read the deed transfer. He read Finch's certification of the lien discharge and the name that was threaded through every page, every signature line, every authorization. Grace Miller, acting agent. Grace Miller, authorized representative. Grace Miller, founding matron. Miller Whitaker, House of Mercy pending. He looked up from the papers. He looked at Margaret. "Who is Grace Miller?" he said. The question was very quiet. That was the thing about Nathaniel Whitaker. He was most dangerous when he was quietest. It was something Grace had understood from the first time she'd watched him in that library. The louder a man performed his power, the less of it he usually had. The quiet ones were the ones you needed to watch. Margaret's face moved through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and then something that tried to be dismissive and didn't quite get there. "My servant," she said. "A nobody." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Clara flinched. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. Eleanor looked at the floor. Rebecca looked at Margaret with the expression of a woman who had just seen someone make a fatal error in a negotiation and couldn't decide whether to be horrified or relieved. It wasn't her. Nathaniel looked at Margaret for a long moment. His expression didn't change. It had already changed back when he'd read Grace's name on the papers for the 3rd time, and something had locked into place behind his eyes that wasn't going to move. "A nobody," he repeated. Flat. Final. "She's the hired help, Nathaniel. She was acting on my—" "She found my mother's brooch," Nathaniel said. "She tracked Silas Crow through court records that most lawyers wouldn't have known to look at. She negotiated the purchase of a building and the discharge of a 15-year-old lien and set up a charitable trust and put the whole thing in your name." He looked at the papers in his hand. "And you called her a nobody." Margaret stopped. Started again. "I gave her direction. I told her what I wanted. She was carrying out—" "She put your name on the matron's position," Nathaniel said. "On the trust board. On the building." He set the papers down slowly. "She gave you credit for something she did entirely on her own, and the first word you used to describe her is nobody." The silence afterward was the kind that doesn't end cleanly. It just sits there. Margaret's composure was still technically intact. She was at her core, a woman with tremendous discipline, but something underneath it had shifted and couldn't shift back. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this room. She was someone standing in the ruins of a performance she had been very confident about. "I'd like to meet her," Nathaniel said. "She's outside," Margaret said, very quietly. "With the carriage." "Then bring her in." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Reed stepped toward the door, and nobody stopped him, and his footsteps crossed the hallway, and the front door opened, and the summer air came through it. Grace heard her name. Not called Reed, didn't call. He simply opened the door and said quietly, "Miss Miller, he's asking for you." She had been sitting on the carriage step. She had known in the abstract that this moment was coming. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most difficult things, by deciding in advance that she was going to be steady and then trusting herself to hold to that. She stood up. She smoothed her apron. She walked up the front steps of Whitaker Hall for the first time as someone who had been asked to be there. When she came through the parlor door, 4 pairs of female eyes turned toward her with 4 different expressions. Clara's was blank. Rebecca's was calculating. Eleanor's was of all things almost sympathetic. Margaret's was unreadable, which meant it was probably the most complicated of all. And Nathaniel's was the one that mattered. He looked at her the way he had not looked at any of the other women that morning, without assessment, without the careful distance of a man running a test. He looked at her the way he had looked at the brooch, like something real had just walked into the room. "Miss Miller," he said. "Sir?" Grace said. Her voice was level. She was very good at that. "Did you choose everything in this box?" "Yes, sir." "The brooch, the building, the lien discharge?" "Yes." "Why the lien?" He held up the papers. Most people would have stopped at the brooch. Finding it was enough. Why spend the rest on a debt that was already 14 years old? Grace held his gaze. "Because the debt had your mother's name on it," she said. "And I thought you'd want it gone." Something moved across Nathaniel's face, quick and unguarded the way real things always are. "How did you know about my mother?" he said. "I saw you with the watch," Grace said. "At the Randolph estate, in the library. You didn't know I was there." She paused. "You looked like a man carrying something heavy. I started paying attention after that." The room was very still. "You were paying attention to me," he said. Not accusing. Something else entirely. "I pay attention to most things," Grace said. "It's what you do when you can't afford not to." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the brooch still in his hand, and then at Grace, and then at something that was not in the room at all. Some interior calculation that was happening faster than words could keep up with. Then he turned to Margaret. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Thank you for coming. I think we're done here." Margaret stood up slowly. Her face had gone the particular white of a woman who is refusing to let what she's feeling show on her face, and who is only partially succeeding. She gathered her gloves. She looked at Grace once, a long, flat look, and then she looked at Nathaniel, and something in that look was not humiliation, but something older and harder than humiliation. "You're making a mistake," she said, very quietly. "I've made plenty," Nathaniel said. "This isn't one of them." Margaret walked out. Clara followed with the rigid back of a woman who would not allow herself to run. Rebecca gathered her satchel without a word. Eleanor paused at the door and looked back at Nathaniel with an expression that was perhaps the most honest thing she had shown all morning. "She's remarkable," Eleanor said, not spitefully, almost sadly. "You know that." "I'm beginning to," Nathaniel said. Eleanor nodded once and left. The door closed, and Grace Miller stood in the middle of Nathaniel Whitaker's parlor with the summer light coming through the window and the brooch on the table between them, and a silence that was not empty. That was in fact the fullest silence she had ever stood inside. She was waiting for him to say something that made the ground solid again. She was waiting to find out whether truth was worth what it had cost. The silence lasted long enough that Judge Reed quietly excused himself from the room. He didn't make a production of it. He simply set down his glass, picked up his hat, and walked out with the discretion of a man who understood that some conversations needed walls and no witnesses. The door clicked shut behind him, and then there were only 2 people in the parlor, and the brooch on the table between them and everything it meant. Nathaniel hadn't moved. He was still standing at the head of the table, still holding the trust papers in one hand, and he was looking at Grace with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 34 years being very careful about what he allowed himself to feel, and was in this moment losing that carefulness one layer at a time. "Sit down, Miss Miller," he said. Grace sat. Not because she was accustomed to being told to sit. She was accustomed to being told to stand, to wait, to stay out of the way. But because her legs, if she was being honest with herself, were not entirely reliable right now. Nathaniel sat across from her. He set the papers down. He looked at the brooch. "How long did it take you to find it?" he said. "1 day to find Crow," Grace said. 2 hours to negotiate with him. "You negotiated with Silas Crow." He said it like he was testing the words, like he wasn't sure they were real. "He's not as frightening as his reputation suggests," Grace said. "He's just a man who's learned that people are more afraid of debt than they are of anything else. Once you take that away, he doesn't have much left." Nathaniel studied her. "You took that away by buying the debt." "I discharged the lien, yes." "And the Marsh Street house." "Yes." "With someone else's money." Grace held his gaze. "With the money I was given to act on someone else's behalf. That's what I was told to do, act on Margaret's behalf. I acted on it." "That's not what she meant, and you know it." "No," Grace agreed. "It's not." A beat. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "You're not going to apologize for it." "I don't believe I did anything wrong," Grace said. "If I'm mistaken about that, I'd like to know why." Nathaniel leaned back. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that focused, level attention that she had noticed before, the kind of attention that didn't slide off a person, that actually landed and stayed. It was unnerving. She was used to being looked past, not looked at. "Tell me about your father," he said. Grace didn't answer it immediately. The question caught her sideways. She'd been braced for something about the money, about Margaret, about the impropriety of what she'd done. Not that. "He was a blacksmith," she said finally. "Good one. We had a shop in Fredericksburg. Then the drought came, and after the drought came the debt, and after the debt came Silas Crow." She paused. "Not Crow himself. Men like him. The process is the same regardless of the name on the door." "What happened?" "My father lost the shop. We moved in with my mother's cousin for a winter. My father died the following spring, not from anything specific, from the particular kind of hopelessness that settles in a man who built something with his hands and watched it taken apart by paper." Her voice was level. It was always level. "My mother found work as a laundress. I went into service at 16. Margaret's family hired me when I was 19. Nathaniel was quiet. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Grace said quickly. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm asking because I want to understand how you knew to look, how you saw what nobody else saw." Grace looked at the brooch. "Pain leaves marks," she said. "People who've carried it learn to recognize it in other people. Rich people learn to hide it. Poor people learn to see it." She looked back at him. "You had it hidden pretty well, but not from someone who knew what to look for." Something moved across his face, the same quick, unguarded thing she'd seen earlier. He picked up the brooch and held it, and she watched him look at his mother's face with the expression of a man returning to a place he'd been locked out of for a long time. "She was 22 in this portrait," he said. "Same age as you." Grace didn't say anything. "She never complained," Nathaniel said. "That was the thing, that she never once said it was unfair. She just carried it, right up until she couldn't anymore." His jaw tightened. "I was 12 when she died. I swore to myself I was going to be rich enough that nothing would ever be taken from me again." He set the brooch down very carefully. "I got rich, and I still couldn't get this back. I tried twice. Both times Crow told me he didn't have it." Grace's eyes sharpened. "He lied to you?" "Yes." "He had it the whole time?" "Apparently so." "He told me he'd had it for 14 years when I sat across from him," Grace said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "He knew exactly who it belonged to. He knew your name, and he looked you in the face and told you he didn't have it." "That's the thing about men like Crow," Nathaniel said. "They understand that some things are worth more held than sold. As long as he had something I wanted, he had power over me. Power he hadn't earned and didn't deserve." He paused. "Until you walked in and took it from him." "I paid fair market value," Grace said. "I know. I saw the documents." For the first time, the almost smile became real brief, real, and gone. What was his face like when you left? Grace thought about it. Like a man who'd just realized he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he hadn't bothered to take seriously. Good, Nathaniel said simply. The next silence was different from the others. It was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence between two people who have just understood something important about each other and are still deciding what to do with it. Then Nathaniel stood. "I want to make you an offer," he said. Grace's hands stilled in her lap. "The Miller-Whitaker House of Mercy. And before you say anything, I'm keeping that name. Your name is on it first, and it's staying there needs an organizer. Someone to run the intake process, manage the accounts, oversee the staff." He looked at her directly. "That person should be you." Grace opened her mouth, closed it. "I'll pay you," Nathaniel said, and he named a figure that made her go very still. Not a servant's wage, not a charity position. A salary. A real one. "I'll also provide housing on the property adjacent to the building and a small operating account in your name for day-to-day management decisions." "You'd be giving me authority," Grace said carefully. "I'd be giving you what you've already demonstrated you can handle," he said. "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm making a sound decision." She looked at him for a moment. "And Margaret?" "Miss Bellamy and I are finished," Nathaniel said. She made that clear herself when she opened her mouth. "She'll be angry." "She's already angry. There's nothing I can do about that." "She'll talk," Grace said. "To anyone who'll listen. She'll say I manipulated her, that I went behind her back, that I took advantage of the money she trusted me with." She paused. "Some of that is even arguable." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "Is that what you believe? That you went too far?" Grace thought about it. Honestly. The way she thought about most things, without the benefit of self-deception, because self-deception was a luxury that required more cushioning than she'd ever had. "I went further than I was asked to," she said. "I made decisions that weren't technically mine to make. I used someone else's name without their full informed consent." She held his gaze. "But I didn't take anything for myself. I didn't lie about what the money bought. And every woman in the Marsh Street house is sleeping in a clean bed tonight because of it." She paused. "I can hold both of those things at once, the impropriety and the rightness. They're both true." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're the most honest person I've spoken to in 5 years." "That's a sad statement about the last 5 years," Grace said. He laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to and didn't know what to do with it afterward. He recovered quickly, but the room felt different after it. "Will you take the position?" he said. Grace looked at the brooch one more time. "Yes," she said. "I will." She did not tell him, not yet. Not in this room. Not with everything still so raw and new that she would have done it all again for nothing. That she had not been thinking about positions or salaries when she walked into Silas Crow's warehouse. That she had been thinking about a dead woman's face on a chip of ivory, and a man who pressed his palm to library windows like he was trying to reach through them. That was a truth for another time. She had already spent enough courage for one morning. What she didn't account for was Margaret. Margaret Bellamy left Whitaker Hall in the kind of silence that is not quiet at all. The silence of a woman who is composing what she will say the moment she has an audience for it. She had the carriage to herself on the way back because Grace was not with her, and she used every mile of that road to build her version of events into something she could live inside. By the time she reached home, she had constructed a story where Grace was a schemer, a calculating servant who had seen an opportunity and seized it, who had used Margaret's trust and Margaret's money to engineer a situation that served Grace's own ambitions. A woman with nothing who had decided to use a wealthy woman's charity as a ladder. She told this version to her mother first, then to Louisa, then to a wider circle that expanded outward through the county like a stone dropped in still water. She manipulated everyone, Margaret told Louisa 3 days later, with her voice arranged into the register of a woman who has been wronged but is choosing to be gracious about it. She manipulated Nathaniel most of all. He thinks he's seeing character. He's seeing performance. Louisa listened carefully. And the brooch, she said. The building, the lien. Anyone could have found those things with enough money and enough time, Margaret said. The money wasn't hers. The time wasn't hers. She was working on my behalf and she took credit for it. Louisa was quiet for a moment. Did she, though? I understood she put your name on everything. Margaret's jaw tightened. She put my name on it as a cover, to make herself indispensable to the story. Louisa said nothing. She had known Margaret for 15 years, and she understood, as old friends do, when a person is arguing against something they secretly know is true. The gossip reached Nathaniel within a week. Reed brought it to him directly, the way Reed always brought difficult things plainly, without decoration, with the confidence of a man who believed his friend was better served by information than by comfort. Margaret is telling people Grace used her, Reed said. That the whole thing was a scheme. People are listening because Margaret is very convincing when she's wronged, and because a servant girl outmaneuvering 4 society women is a story that makes some people uncomfortable. Nathaniel looked at him. And what do you think? I think I watched Grace Miller walk into your parlor without knowing whether she was going to be praised or punished, and I think she held herself together with the composure of someone who had decided the truth was worth whatever it cost her. Reed paused. I've watched a lot of people under pressure. She's the real thing. I know, Nathaniel said. The gossip is going to follow her, Reed said. Wherever she goes, whatever she does. Margaret's version of events is easier to believe for people who want something to believe. It's tidy. It makes the world make sense. The world making sense, Nathaniel said, is not the same as the world being right. No, Reed agreed, but it's more comfortable, and most people prefer comfortable. Nathaniel stood up. What would you do, Samuel? Reed considered. I'd make it very clear very publicly whose version of events I believed, and I'd do it in a way that couldn't be mistaken for uncertainty. He picked up his hat. That's what I'd do. The next day, Nathaniel rode to Richmond. He went to Finch's office first, where he reviewed every document connected to the trust, the deed, the lien, discharge, the board of directors, the matron's appointment. He read them all the way through. He asked Finch 2 questions. The first, did Miss Miller make any attempt to put herself in a position of personal financial gain? Finch looked at him over his glasses. Quite the opposite. She spent the last of the available funds on the lien discharge. She left herself nothing. She made sure the trust was structured so that the matron's salary, the position she was named to, required board approval to change. She built in protections for everyone except herself. The second question, is there anything in these documents that could reasonably support the claim that this was a manipulation? Finch was quiet for a moment. Only if you believe that doing something generous for someone who didn't ask for it and didn't know about it constitutes manipulation, he said. In which case, I suppose almost any kindness could be called a scheme. Nathaniel thanked him and left. He went next to the Marsh Street house, or what had been the Marsh Street house, because Mrs. Abel had already replaced the sign with a temporary painted board that read simply, Miller Whittaker House of Mercy, open to all women. Mrs. Abel met him at the door. She was a broad, direct woman with flower on her sleeve and no patience for ceremony. She looked at Nathaniel with the frank assessment of a woman who had learned to evaluate people quickly. You're the Whittaker, she said. I am. She looked him over. You look like someone who's trying to decide if this place is what he hoped it would be. Is it? It's going to be, she said. We've got 13 women right now. 3 of them are sick. One of them had a baby 2 weeks ago with no husband and nowhere to go. 2 of the older ones are teaching the younger ones to read in the evenings because Grace said we should. She folded her arms. What it's going to be depends on what you're willing to put behind it. That's what I came to discuss, Nathaniel said. He spent 2 hours with Mrs. Abel. He came away with a list of what the building needed: repair supplies, a physician willing to attend twice a week, a small library of practical books, and a clear understanding that the operation was already functioning with the efficiency of something that had been planned by someone who thought carefully and wasted nothing. He thought about Grace the whole ride back. He thought about her at 22, going into service at 16, watching her father break apart quietly in someone else's house. He thought about how she had walked into Crow's warehouse with someone else's money and outmaneuvered a man who had beaten him twice. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the parlor when he'd asked if she was going to apologize. Steady, direct, not defiant exactly, but not bending either. The way you look when you've decided the truth has more value than the approval of the person you're talking to. He had known a lot of people with money. He had known a few with intelligence. He had known almost none with that particular combination of clarity and courage that didn't require an audience to hold its shape. When he got back to Whitaker Hall, Reed was waiting on the porch. "How was Richmond?" Reed said. "Instructive," Nathaniel said. "And the House of Mercy?" "Real," Nathaniel said. "It's real." He stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at the summer evening, at the long road that ran away from his property toward the rest of the world. "She built something real, Samuel. In 30 days with no help with money that wasn't even hers for people she'd never met." He was quiet for a moment, because a lien had a dead woman's name on it. Reed was quiet. "I've been testing women for character," Nathaniel said. "I designed the whole thing, the envelopes, the 30 days, all of it, because I was convinced you had to create a test to see what people were made of." He shook his head slowly. "And while I was running my test, a servant girl who wasn't even invited into the room was just being herself. No test required, no audience, no prize." He turned to look at Reed. "What does that tell you?" Reed considered. "That character isn't something you perform when you're being evaluated," he said. "It's what you do when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for you." "That's right," Nathaniel said. He was silent for a moment, and then he made two decisions quickly, the way he made all his best decisions, without the interference of second-guessing. The first was to write a letter to every family that had received Margaret's version of events. A clear, direct, factually precise letter that described exactly what Grace Miller had done, what she had bought, how she had done it, and what it had meant to him. He did not ask for their revised opinion. He stated his own and let the facts speak. The second decision was to ride to Grace. She was staying temporarily at a boarding house on the edge of town. She had not gone back to Margaret's house after that morning at Whitaker Hall, which showed either tremendous courage or a very accurate read of how quickly she'd be dismissed if she did. He sent word first because arriving unannounced at a woman's boarding house was its own kind of problem, and Grace Miller had enough problems already. Her reply came back within the hour. 3 sentences in small, precise handwriting. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Come whenever you like." He rode out the next morning. She met him on the narrow porch, standing with her arms at her sides and that steady posture she had, not rigid, not performing anything, just present in herself in a way that most people spent their whole lives failing to achieve. She looked at him and waited. "I wrote to the families," he said, "to counter what Margaret's been saying." "You didn't have to do that," Grace said. "I know I didn't have to." He stepped up onto the porch. "That's why I did it." She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, but the lowering of something she'd been holding up for a long time. "She'll still be angry," Grace said. "Yes, she will. She has connections, influence. She can make it difficult for the clinic, for Mrs. Abel, for the women inside. She can try," Nathaniel said. "She'll find it harder than she expects." He paused. "I own the building now. I have the trust documents, and I have the resources to make sure that place is standing long after the gossip finds something new to chew on." Grace was quiet. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty," Nathaniel said. "And I'm not doing it to impress you." "I know," Grace said. "I'm doing it because it's right," he said. "And because my mother's name deserves to be attached to something that lasts." Grace looked at him for a long, still moment. The summer evening was warm around them, the way Virginia evenings are in late July, slow, heavy with heat. The kind of air that makes everything feel a little more real than usual. She would have liked it, Grace said quietly. The clinic, what it's going to be. Nathaniel looked at her. How can you know that? Because she looks like a woman who would, Grace said. In the portrait. She looks like someone who would have walked right past the carriage and the supper party and gone straight to the room where someone needed help. He was quiet. She raised you, Grace said. You see her in people who are suffering. That comes from somewhere. For the second time in a week, Nathaniel Whitaker had nothing to say, and Grace Miller stood in the summer evening and understood with a clarity that was not comfortable but was very clean, that the ground beneath her had just shifted into something that had not existed before, something that was not yet named, was not yet safe to name, but was real. It was real. And for a woman who had spent her whole life dealing in things that were real hunger, real loss, real work, real courage, that was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The letter from Margaret's family lawyer arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the parlor at Whitaker Hall had emptied of everything except silence and 2 people standing in it. Nathaniel read it once, set it down, read it again, and then walked directly to the stables and rode to Grace without sending word first. She was at the clinic. She spent most mornings there now, working alongside Mrs. Abel on intake records, reviewing the accounts, interviewing a young physician named Dr. Ellsworth, who had agreed to attend twice a week for a fee that was modest by Richmond standards and generous by the clinics. She was in the middle of explaining to Dr. Ellsworth that the intake process needed to be confidential and that no woman's reason for arriving would be written in any document that left the building when she heard hooves on the road outside and recognized from the rhythm of them that Nathaniel was riding fast. She excused herself. He was already off the horse when she came out, and he had the letter in his hand. Margaret's family has filed a legal challenge, he said. He gave her the letter directly, no preamble, no softening. He had learned quickly that Grace preferred directness to comfort. Their argument is that you acted as Margaret's agent without full informed consent, that the deed transfer is therefore void, and that the trust should be dissolved and the money returned. Grace read the letter. She read it slowly, which was how she read everything that mattered. They want the building back, she said. They want to give it back to Crow, Nathaniel said. Or sell it. Their lawyer is claiming the whole transaction was fraudulent. It wasn't fraudulent, Grace said. I know that. Margaret told me to spend the money on something meaningful. She gave me the envelope herself. She said, take the wagon, take whatever you need. Grace looked at him. Those were her exact words. Did anyone else hear her say them? Grace was quiet for a moment. The carriage driver, she said. Nathaniel exhaled. Can we find him? His name is Thomas Wick. He works for the Bellamy family. Then he's Margaret's employee. Yes, she paused. But he's an honest man. Honest men with debts owed to powerful families tend to remember things the way the family wants them remembered, Nathaniel said. We can't count on him. Grace folded the letter precisely and handed it back. Then what can we count on? The documents, Nathaniel said. Finch's records. The fact that your name is on everything, and Margaret never objected until the morning she realized she'd lost. He looked at her steadily. And Reed. I want Reed to argue the case. Will he? I already rode past his office on the way here, he said, and I'm quoting directly. Tell Grace Miller I have never lost a case I believed in, and I believe in this one unreservedly. Then he told me to stop wasting his time and let him read the documents. Something moved through Grace's chest, warm, brief, real. She turned it down quickly, the way you turn down a lamp when you need to see clearly. Margaret is going to testify, Grace said. She'll be convincing. She's always convincing. I know. She'll say I went behind her back, that I manipulated her trust. She'll believe it by the time she's finished saying it because that's how she works. She tells a story until she can't tell the difference between the story and the truth. Then we tell ours louder, Nathaniel said. He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who had built an empire on the premise that the right thing done correctly and without flinching, eventually outweighs the convenient thing. Grace had seen it in him from the beginning, that bedrock stubbornness that looked like calm, but was actually something far more immovable. "They're going to drag your name through the county," Grace said. "Yours, not just mine. A man of your standing defending a servant girl against one of the oldest families in Virginia. People will say you've lost your judgment. They'll say I've bewitched you. They'll say, I know what they'll say." He looked at her directly. "Do you think I care?" "You should," Grace said. "Your reputation is a resource. Resources matter. My mother died in a house where her suffering was invisible because she had no one with enough standing to name it out loud," Nathaniel said. "I have that standing. I am going to use it." He paused. "For once in my life, I am going to use it for something that deserves it, and I would very much appreciate it if you would stop trying to protect me from the decision I've already made." The silence that followed had a different quality than the others. Warmer and also a little dangerous, the way silences get between two people who are standing closer to something than either of them has said aloud. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right. All right. All right, let Reed argue it." She straightened. "I want to testify." "Grace, I want to stand in that room and say exactly what happened," she said. "In my own words, without anyone translating it for me." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "I've been invisible my whole life, Nathaniel. I am not going to be invisible in the room where they're deciding whether what I did was real." He looked at her. He did not argue. "All right," he said. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks was enough time for the gossip to reach a full boil, and for opinions to harden along the lines that opinions always harden: those with money and social standing behind Margaret, those with neither watching to see whether the outcome confirmed what they already suspected about how justice worked for people like Grace. Mrs. Abel ran the clinic without slowing down for any of it. "Let them argue," she told Grace on the morning of the second week. "We've got 16 women in here now, 3 more coming next week. The baby that was born without a father has a name and a warm blanket. I'm not stopping." "I know," Grace said. "Nobody's asking you to stop. I'm just saying." Mrs. Abel said that the building is full whether or not some lawyer wins an argument, and what's full stays full. She pointed her flour-dusted finger at Grace with the authority of a woman who had earned every opinion she held. "What those women in there know is that someone saw them. That's what you gave them. No court undoes that." Grace nodded. She pressed her hands flat on the table between them and breathed. "Are you frightened?" Mrs. Abel asked. Directly, the way she asked everything. "Yes," Grace said. "I'm frightened of losing the building. I'm frightened of what it means for the women inside if we lose." She paused. "I'm not frightened of standing up and saying what I did." Mrs. Abel looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said. "Hold on to that difference." The night before the hearing, Nathaniel rode out to the boarding house again. Grace met him on the porch. The summer was tipping toward fall. Now the air had the first cool edge of something changing, and she had a shawl around her shoulders, and they stood in the early dark, the way they had been standing in more evenings than either of them had counted. "Reed says the documents are strong," Nathaniel said. "The consent question is arguable either way, but the intent is clear. And Finch will testify about Grace's conduct throughout: the way she built in safeguards, the way she protected the trust structure, the way she waived any personal financial benefit." "And Thomas Wick," Grace said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "He came forward this morning," he said. Grace went still. "On his own," Nathaniel said. "He came to Reed's office and asked to make a statement. He said he heard Margaret tell you to spend the money on something meaningful. He said he heard her say, 'Take whatever you need.' He said he'd been thinking about it for 6 weeks, and he couldn't live with staying quiet." A pause. "He said his own mother spent 2 winters in a place like the Marsh Street house when he was a boy. He said he reckoned that mattered more than his job." Grace sat down on the porch step. Not dramatically, her legs just decided, without consulting her, that they needed to be lower to the ground. "He could lose his position," she said. "He knows that. Margaret will dismiss him." "Almost certainly." Grace pressed both hands over her face. Not crying, she rarely cried. It had been trained out of her young. But something behind her eyes was hot, and she needed a moment. "I'll hire him," Nathaniel said quietly. "Whatever he needs, he won't suffer for it." Grace lowered her hands. She looked out at the dark road. "One honest man," she said. "That's all it takes sometimes." "Sometimes that's all anything takes," Nathaniel said. The hearing the next morning was not a trial. It was a civil proceeding, quieter in ceremony, not in tension. The room was small and full, and the benches were lined with people who had come to witness, which told you everything about what the county understood was really on trial. Margaret sat across the room in dove-gray silk with her lawyer at her elbow, and her composure assembled into something that looked very much like dignity. She did not look at Grace. She looked at the judge, at the documents, at the middle distance, the curated gaze of a woman performing injured innocence for a room. She needed to believe her. The judge was a man named Harkins, 60 dry, without apparent sentiment. He read every document himself before the proceedings began, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and nobody in the room could tell which. Reed argued first. He was methodical, precise, and occasionally devastating. The way good lawyers are devastating not through rhetoric, but through the simple act of arranging facts so clearly that any alternative explanation looks absurd. He submitted Finch's testimony. He submitted Thomas Wick's statement. He submitted the trust documents, the deed transfer, the lien discharge, the correspondence trail, the matron's appointment. He rested his argument with, "Miss Miller was given money, explicit authorization to act, and no instruction beyond, make me look thoughtful. She made choices consistent with that authorization, and beyond it only in their generosity. She purchased nothing for herself. She protected a charitable institution, discharged a historical injustice, and recovered a family heirloom for a man who had been seeking it for 14 years. The question before this court is not whether she exceeded her mandate. The question is whether a woman doing more good than she was asked to do constitutes fraud. If it does, then this court is applying a definition of fraud that the law does not recognize and common decency cannot support." Margaret's lawyer argued for 40 minutes. He was smooth, well-prepared, and working with a genuinely arguable legal point. The consent question was real, the agency question was real, but Reed had built the factual foundation so solidly that the argument kept sliding off it. Then the judge looked at Grace and said, "Miss Miller, you may address the court." Grace stood. She had thought about what she was going to say. She had prepared it carefully, the way she prepared everything, not by writing it down because she didn't trust written words to carry what she needed carried, but by sitting with it quietly until it was clear. "I was given money and told to spend it on something meaningful," she said. Her voice was level and clear and reached every corner of the room. "I spent it on the most meaningful thing I could find. I recovered a dead woman's face from the man who had stolen it. I freed 11 living women from a building that was taking their lives apart one day at a time. I put the name of the woman who employed me on everything I built because I was acting on her behalf and I believed the work deserved a name." She paused. "I took nothing for myself. I asked for nothing in return. I did not know when I did it whether anyone would ever know my name was connected to any of it." Another pause. "I did it because it was right. Not because it was safe or smart or in my interest, because it was right, and I would do it again tomorrow." The room was very quiet. Margaret was looking at Grace now, for the first time all morning. Her face had gone through several expressions in the space of Grace's testimony. Contempt, then something complicated, then something that might have been in a woman with different habits the beginning of shame. Grace looked back at her briefly without accusation. Then she sat down. Judge Harkins took 40 minutes to deliberate. He came back and read his ruling in the flat, careful language of a man who was determined not to be quoted out of context, and what it amounted to was this. The deed transfer was valid, the trust was valid, the lien discharge was valid, and the Miller-Whitaker House of Mercy would remain exactly what Grace Miller had made it. He added one sentence at the end that was not strictly speaking required by the ruling. "It is the opinion of this court that Miss Miller's conduct throughout this matter demonstrates an unusual degree of integrity and public spiritedness, and that the charitable institution she has established serves a genuine public need that this county has long failed to adequately address. He banged his gavel and left. The room broke into sound. Reed shook Grace's hand with both of his. Finch in the second row permitted himself a small, satisfied nod. Thomas Wick in the back of the room looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just been allowed to set it down. Nathaniel was beside her in 3 steps. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood beside her shoulder to shoulder, and she felt the warmth of that, the particular warmth of someone standing next to you, not to protect you, not to present you, but simply because they wanted to be where you were. Reed was magnificent, she said. He always is, Nathaniel said. But you were better. She looked at him. You said what needed to be said, he told her. In that room with Margaret 6 feet away and a judge who didn't owe you anything. You said it plainly, and you didn't flinch. He paused. That takes a kind of courage that most people don't have. I was frightened the whole time, Grace said. I know. That's what makes it courage. Margaret left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. She paused at the door once turned halfway with her hand on the frame, and for a moment it looked as though she was going to say something. To Grace, maybe. Or to the room. Or to herself. Whatever it was, she didn't say it. She turned back and walked out, and the door closed behind her. And that was the last time Grace Miller and Margaret Bellamy were ever in the same room. The months that followed moved differently than months had moved before. The clinic grew. By October, it had 23 women in residence, a full-time physician's arrangement with Dr. Ellsworth, a small library donated by 3 county families who had reconsidered their position on Grace after the hearing, and a kitchen garden managed by 2 of the older residents who had declared firmly that they intended to be useful. Mrs. Abel hired 2 more staff. She interviewed each one herself and asked them before anything else a single question. What do you do when someone asks you for help and you think they don't deserve it? She told Grace afterward that the right answer was always some variation of, that's not my call to make. Grace worked 6 days a week. She kept the accounts in a leather ledger that she updated every evening without fail. She wrote reports for the trust board which consisted of herself, Nathaniel Reed, and Finch every month, detailed and precise, with nothing softened and nothing hidden. She hired Thomas Wick to manage the property maintenance, and he proved to be as good as his honesty, which was better than most people managed. Nathaniel came to the clinic 3 times a week, then 4. Then every day for varying amounts of time, with varying pretexts. There was always something to review, always something to discuss, always some operational matter that required his attention alongside hers. Reed noticed. He said nothing for 6 weeks. Then one afternoon, riding back from a board meeting, he said mildly, You're aware, I assume, that the operational matters you're reviewing daily could be handled in a monthly meeting. I have a lot of concerns, Nathaniel said. You have one concern, Reed said, and her name is Grace Miller. Nathaniel didn't deny it. Is that a problem? He said. For the gossips, yes, Reed said. For everyone else, no. He considered. She knows. I know she knows. And? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She's careful, he said. She doesn't move toward things until she's sure the ground is real. You can't rush her. And you shouldn't. He paused. She's spent her whole life having the ground pulled out from under her. She needs to know it holds before she'll trust it. Reed nodded slowly. So you're giving her time? I'm giving her everything she needs, Nathaniel said. Time, work, proof, whatever it takes. That, Reed said, is either the most patient thing I've ever heard you say, or the most determined. Both, Nathaniel said. The moment came on a Tuesday in November, the way the most important moments always come, not announced, not staged, simply there in the middle of something ordinary. They were reviewing the winter supply accounts together, sitting across from each other at the clinic's front desk with the ledger open between them, and Grace had just identified a discrepancy in the firewood order that had been bothering her for 3 days, and she said, Here, right here, the delivery date doesn't match the invoice date, And that means either Wick recorded it wrong or the supplier is double billing us. And she turned the ledger to show him, and their hands were both on the page at the same time, and neither of them moved. The silence that followed was the kind Grace had been living inside for 4 months. The kind that had been filling up slowly the way a room fills with light when a door opens gradually, not all at once, but real. She looked up. Nathaniel was already looking at her. "Grace," he said. Just her name. The way you say something when you've been thinking it for a long time, and the word has worn a groove in you. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "Don't what?" "Don't say it like it's simple," she said. "It's not simple. You know it's not simple." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for simple." She looked at him. Really looked the way she looked at everything that mattered without flinching, without softening, without letting herself want the answer so badly that she couldn't see clearly. "I'm a blacksmith's daughter," she said. "I grew up in debt. I've been in service since I was 16. I have no family name, no property, no standing. I will embarrass you in rooms you need to stand in. People will always have something to say about who you chose and what that means." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "They will. And you don't care." "I care deeply about the work we're doing together," he said. "I care deeply about the women in this building, and what we've built for them. I care deeply about making sure this clinic stands long after both of us are gone." He paused. "And I care deeply about you, in a way that I have not cared about anything since my mother died, which is the most honest thing I have ever said to another person." He held her gaze without wavering. "Whether that embarrasses people is not something I'm willing to measure my life by." Grace was quiet. "You showed me what I was looking for," he said. "Not by trying to. Not in a parlor. Not in a test. Not with $5,000. You showed me by being exactly who you are when you thought nobody was watching." A pause. "I was watching." She thought about a library in the Randolph estate. A man with his palm flat against glass, breathing like someone trying to reach through a wall. She thought about Harriet sitting in the corner of the Marsh Street house with nothing left. She thought about an ivory chip the size of a thumbnail and a young woman's face and 14 years of a wound that nobody had bothered to heal. She thought about what it meant to build something real. "All right," Grace said. She said it the same way she'd said it the day he offered her the position, quietly, plainly, without theater. But it meant something different now, and they both knew it. He reached across the ledger and covered her hand with his, and she let him. And outside the November air was cold and the clinic was warm, and somewhere in the building, Mrs. Abel was teaching someone's name to a child who had never had a reason to learn it before. The sign went up in December. Nathaniel had commissioned it in November, quietly, without telling Grace until the morning it arrived. It was simple painted wood, clean lettering built to last. He walked her out to see it, and she stood in front of it and read it, and the words were exactly what she'd written in Finch's documents all those months ago, when she'd done it without knowing whether anyone would ever care. The Miller-Whitaker House of Mercy. Her name first. She stood there for the long moment. She didn't look at Nathaniel. She looked at the sign, and she thought about her father in a shop in Fredericksburg building things with his hands. She thought about her mother, with her arms in water before sunrise. She thought about 16-year-old Grace carrying a trunk up 3 flights of stairs in a house where nobody knew her name. "My father would have liked this," she said finally. "Tell me about him," Nathaniel said. So she did. She talked about him the way she had never talked about him before, not the version she held carefully, the controlled grief of a person who has learned not to spill, but the real version. The way he laughed, the way he smelled of iron and effort, the way he'd taught her to read invoices before she could read anything else, because he'd said a woman who understands numbers will never be entirely helpless. Nathaniel listened. He was very good at listening. It was the thing she had noticed first about him back in that library before she knew anything else. He listened the way real people listen, without waiting for his turn. When she finished, he said, "He raised someone who tore down a house of suffering and put something better in its place. He would have been proud." She believed him. Nathaniel Whitaker gave $5,000 to 4 women to reveal their hearts. 3 bought mirrors. 1 bought influence from people who had too much of it already. But a blacksmith's daughter, who was not even invited into the room, bought back a dead woman's face, freed 11 strangers from a building designed to swallow them, and proved in a courtroom full of people who doubted her that nobility was never a matter of blood or name or the family you were born into. It was a matter of what you did when no one was watching and nothing was in it for you. Grace Miller had always known that. It just took one honest man, one open door, and one silver brooch for the rest of the world to learn it too.